Great. Well, everyone, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon and this morning in Japan. My name is Larry Greenwood. I'm the actually incoming new chairman of the board of the Japan Society of Northern California. And this is our first program of the year, 2021. And as most of you know, the Japan Society has been around since 1905, and our mission is to create closer understanding and ties between Japan and the Bay Area, and we do that mainly through programs such as the one we're doing today. And you've seen in the slides just that we just stopped showing the programming that we did last year. So we're very active. We try to do 3 to 4 programs a month, so that people can learn about Japan and connect with other people who are passionate about Japan. So again, thank you very much for coming. Every year in January, we here at the Japan Society of Northern California do something we call Japan Outlook, which is a kind of a good way to start the year by looking at what we expect to happen in Japan and in the U.S. Japan relationship in the coming year. And we look at the economics, we look at politics, we look at foreign policy and looking at that. 2020 was obviously not the year that we expected. So looking back at our Japan Outlook program a year ago, none of us had any clue that this was going to be the year, the kind of year that we just have been through. And so I think I'm pretty safe in predicting that, although so far it hasn't been the case, that 2021 from here on out, let me be careful about the timing, is going to be a lot more boring than 2020. And I think we can all be grateful for a boring year, which we will have, at least a more boring one than we had in 2020. But there's going to be a lot happening, obviously, and it's going to be a very important year. I think there's obviously some major areas of change. We are hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for the COVID pandemic, although we still have a long way to go before we exit the tunnel. And we are going to be seeing the reopening of economies, certainly in U.S. and Japan, but also all around the world as we exit the pandemic. And how that's going to be done is going to be, and how quickly it can be done is going to be really important frankly, for all those areas we talked about: the economy, politics, domestic politics, and foreign policy. How COVID has changed our lives, has changed our social lives, our economic lives. How long those changes will take, will last? What kinds of fundamental changes will it mean for how we interact with each other and how we do business, how we conduct our political affairs is going to be, I think, an interesting topic for us as we go into the year. We obviously have major political changes in our two countries. So we have the end of the Trump administration next week, and we have a new prime minister in Japan as of last fall. And so we'll have some new dynamics in terms of our governments. We have what will be the effective, at least for now, the end of the America First approach of the current administration, outgoing administration, and a new administration that's made it very clear already that it's going to be much more engaged with the world and returning more to kind of collaboration, cooperation, and even hopefully leadership in the world. And so that's going to be changed. We also have seen changes in the last year or so from Japan in terms of its emerging leadership role in the region and globally. In some ways, kind of filling the vacuum that the U.S. has left. And it'll be interesting to see how that kind of evolves as we get into the year. And of course, this is all against the backdrop of rising influence and presence of China economically and politically and security in the world and the region. So lots of things happening. It won't be really that boring a year. It's going to be an interesting year. I think it's going to be not just because I'm an optimist, which I am, but I do think it's going to be a good year for the U.S. and Japan and for the U.S.-Japan relationship. So we're looking forward to that and to talk about these these issues. We have two great speakers. Before I introduce them, let me say that what we'll do here is we'll have our two speakers speak, then we'll have a moderated discussion that I will lead, and then we'll be opening up to questions and answers from the audience. So please start thinking of your questions. And in fact, if you have questions already, or as the program proceeds, just put your questions, if you want to put them in writing, in the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom page. And if you would prefer to ask your question orally, just use the raise hand function when we get to that part of the program. So either chat or raise hand, you can submit your questions either way. And also we would encourage you to chat with everybody, with each other privately if you want, using the chat function. Everyone can see each other and communicate with each other. We like to have that kind of, networking going on. Please keep listening to the speakers. Don't ignore them. Don't be distracted, but also feel free to interact with fellow audience members as you wish. So let me get to the program. We have, again, two great speakers. I'll just introduce them and then ask them to speak kind of sequentially. Our first speaker is Jesper Cole. Jesper is one of Japan's top economic commentators. He's been working and living in Japan since 1986, which is coincidentally the year that I also went to Japan for the first time to work. He's worked for JP Morgan, for Merrill Lynch. He's founded an investment bank and asset management company. And he's a member of a number of boards as well as advisory committees. He's advising Governor Koike, for example, now on financial service issues. And he's been just a pillar of the economic analysis community in Tokyo for all those years. So we're really pleased to have Jesper Cole. So let me ask Jesper to take it away. All yours, Jesper.
Great. Thank you very, very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me. I like the fact that you hope that 2021 is going to be a boring year, but from my perspective, from the world of an economist and from the world of a financial strategist and investor, I'm actually super excited. I think that 2021 is not going to be boring, but it's going to be a year of great opportunity, particularly here in Japan. I'm very unashamedly, optimistic. Obviously we still have to deal with the vagaries of COVID. Obviously, the fact that Prime Minister Suga had to declare more stringent emergency measures over the last couple of days is going to have a dent on the first quarter activity, but that should not distract from what actually is driving the incredible opportunity, and really the fact that, in my opinion, Japan does stand at one of these historic inflection points where fundamental change, fundamental opportunity is actually opening up. And let me give you the three pillars that I see underpinning this optimistic outlook for 2021 and 2022. And the first one, of course, is policy pragmatism. I mean, we can debate about Prime Minister Suga until we're blue. There are lots of little interesting things. And obviously, given that this is going to be an election year with the lower house election have to be called before October, politics is going to be on people's minds. But in terms of the policy setting, this is the most pragmatic and most consequential government that we have in the Western world. I mean, there is no squibbling between the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance. They will do the right thing. So, for example, now that the economy is going to be forced into a more slowdown by the emergency declarations, there's no question that there will be expedient, fastly implemented additional fiscal spending, which, yes, the Bank of Japan will willingly, effectively monetize in its positions. So policy pragmatism and the government that no matter what happens in the election, chances of the LDP losing significantly its grip on parliament is basically close to nil. And so this overriding policy pragmatism and pro-business attitude is going to continue to be in place. So policy pragmatism is the first pillar here. The more exciting and most important one, however, is private sector activism. It's very, very interesting. I mean, it really is the case that the corona crisis has become a bit of a catalyst for corporate action, that long overdue decisions that for reasons of complacency, for reasons of corporate culture, for whatever reasons, CEOs or executives were unwilling or incapable of making, now these decisions are being done. And this is very important because these are the decisions that matter, because they actually immediately affect the way a company is run, the way of internal processes. So specifically, what am I talking about? Well, the most obvious one, is the fact that you've got now a much, much greater focus on performance-based assessment of employees with the work from home, telecommuting, now actually widely embraced and openly enforced. I mean, it's incredible to see that you've got leading stalwarts of industrial Japan, like Hitachi Corporation, like Fujitsu Corporation, etc., actually openly contemplating the closure of 25 to 30% of their Tokyo office space, because they do want 20 to 30% of their people to actually telecommute. This change in the work-life balance, this change that is going to flow from this in terms of the processes that have been very cumbersome, that have clogged up decision-making, that have held back the younger generation from actually raising their voice in corporate decision-making and meetings. That change in the corporate culture, I think, is absolutely enormous and makes me very, very hopeful that finally the actual productivity revolution is coming through Japan, because the COVID crisis has been a catalyst for these outdated, behaviors, outdated corporate culture patterns. And of course, the digitalization, speeding up the use of IT and using IT, not just katachi dake, not just for form's sake, but actually to speed up decision and to raise efficiency. That, I think, is something that makes me very, very hopeful, and I think actually creates an enormous opportunity for companies like your own companies, to get involved as corporate Japan is changing, as corporate Japan is opening up. The other element of private sector activism is that you see an incredible pickup in the metabolism of corporate activity. I mean, just look at the data. Last year, we saw a record year of domestic M&A activity. You saw a record year of tender offer bids and management buyouts, and you saw a record year of IPOs, of new initial public offerings. So the juices, the animal spirits of corporate Japan are not just alive and kicking, they're actually taking action. And this is very, very important, that corporate leaders are not just contemplating changes in corporate governance, changes in dividends and share buybacks, but they've gone beyond that. They are now actually implementing proactive growth strategies by mergers, by acquisitions, by management buyouts, etc., etc. And that's very exciting. And here's a prediction for 2021. I believe that we will see a burst of M&A activity outside of Japan, where you've got the Fortune 50, the Fortune 100 Japanese corporations, embarking on an aggressive overseas expansion spree. Specifically, I'm actually, very much looking forward to one of the Japanese mega banks acquiring either an American or an Asian bank. So I think that, you know, the metabolism of corporate Japan, not just talking about capital stewardship, about corporate governance, all this good stuff that we've been talking about, you know, over the last 4 or 5 years. Now it's actually growth strategies and action through acquisitions, through spin-outs, through management buyouts actually coming through. And you also, by the way, see these investments for growth in the way Japanese corporations are hiring. Obviously, with the COVID crisis, we have seen a surge in unemployment and furlough. You know, the workforce, the people working here is about 61 million people. Unemployment increased by about 1.7 million people, and the number of people on furlough are a similar 1.7 people. And there's no question that, you know, it was, of course, the part-time workers, the arbeito, you know, that were hit the hardest. They were the ones who were let loose, right? But what is interesting, over the last 4 or 5 months, the data actually shows that full-time employment is now making a comeback. In other words, that yes, companies use the crisis to throw out, you know, to let go of some of the weaker, you know, parts of, you know, their employees. But now that they're actually hiring back, you know, you are actually seeing a growth of full-time employment coming through. And that's, of course, where the great structural advantage of Japan's demography comes in, namely the fact that labor and skill is in short supply structurally, and that corporate Japan is now fully aware that to actually have loyal and productive, you know, particularly young employees, you actually do need to hire on a full-time basis rather than on a part-time basis. So it's very interesting to me that you've got this pickup in corporate activism, that you've got corporate leaders actually making decisions to grow the company, you know, to invest in other companies through mergers and acquisitions, and to invest in human capital by actually increasing the number of full-time employees that they're taking on board. That makes me very, very excited about the outlook there, and I will try and verify, or we all will be able to verify this thesis by actually monitoring M&A activity, you know, here in Japan going forward, as well as, by the way, IPO activity with a tremendous amount, you know, of new entrepreneurs having companies that are now beyond the proof of concept stage and are actually ready to go to the market. So 2021, watch for a record year of M&A activity, a burst of outside M&A activity, Japan acquiring the world. And on top of that, you know, watch for the Japanese labor market actually to show a structural improvement with full-time hiring rather than part-time hiring coming through. So policy pragmatism, private sector activism, and then the last, you know, a reason to be optimistic, you know, is the proximity that Japan has to the one credible, sustainable growth area of the world, which of course is Asia Pacific. And here we have to point out the incredible restructuring success that corporate Japan did. Because 10, 12 years ago, Japan was very lopsided in its dependence on the United States of America. I mean, if you look at the data for listed companies 10 years ago, about 50% of the earnings came from exports to or productions in the United States of America. This has now come down to about 24%. Against that, profits coming from exports to or production in the People's Republic of China have gone from 8% 10 years ago to 24% now, and the rest of Asia has also grown to about 24%. So what I'm saying is that you actually have had a wonderful balancing of Japan's global you know, impact and global profit map. It used to be lopsidedly dependent on the United States, and we all got this, you know, remember, you know, over the last 20 years, it was always right, you know, when America sneezes, Japan will catch pneumonia. That just simply is no longer the case. because you do find the global the global distribution, the global balance much more balanced, with, as I mentioned, now about 24% coming from the US, of profits coming from the US, 24% from China, and 24% from the rest of Asia. And it's very interesting. People think of 2020 as sort of this scary year for the economy, which of course in many ways it was. But I mean, look at the fact that Toyota Corporation had a record a record high of cars produced ever, a historic high. And it's interesting when you do look at Toyota, just to undermine the point I made earlier about the new global map. You find that Toyota's factories in the United States now have a profit margin that is about 3 times lower than the profit margin that Toyota's factories have in the People's Republic of China. So what I'm trying to say is the following. You've got this overarching policy pragmatism. You've got corporate activism in terms of corporate leaders actually implementing, not just talking about, pro-growth strategies. And then you've got an underlying business model, certainly for the industrial companies, that is very, very well balanced and is actually geared into the highest growth area on the world. So that makes me very, very exciting, and I do expect that Japan is going to end 2021, with probably an unemployment rate that is going to be at least 1 percentage points below where we are right now. In other words, going back into the 2 point something rather than being at the sort of 3.5, 3.4 that we have right now. And on top of that, I do think that, for global businesses like yourselves, I do think that the fact that corporate managers are looking for growth strategies, are making decisions and implementing, I think that this is a great time to actually increase your engagement with Japanese corporations and their leaders. One point, what is the biggest risk? The biggest risk, in my opinion, would be a currency war. Obviously, the threat of a US dollar devaluation, does loom quite large. And then, of course, God forbid, there would be the threat, of the People's Republic of China, should its growth policy stall, the People's Republic of China being forced into a currency devaluation of the renminbi. So I actually think that the risk on the currency side, with the risk of a dollar devaluation and or the risk of a renminbi devaluation, that's something that keeps me up at night. Let me stop here. I think we're going to have lots of questions, and I hope we'll have some fun. But I, thought I'd give you these 3 little points of optimism.
Okay, thanks, Jesper. And I'm not surprised that you're optimistic. You've always been a great. You've always been optimistic about Japan, and you've been proven right. I think so. Even when others were down on Japan, Jesper was always looking at the dynamism in Japan that others missed. And so, again, thank you very much for that. Actually, but one last thing, if I can just ask you one quick question. We'll get into Q&A later after Watanabe-san speaks. But do you have a growth projection for 2021?
Yeah, I think that the Japanese economy is, after a weak first quarter, I think that you'll end up, with economic growth of somewhere between 5 and 6%. Which basically, Larry, when you put this in perspective, in 2020 the economy contracted by about 5.5%. So for all intents and purposes, that Japan will be back in terms of the absolute level of GDP and resource utilization, etc., back to where we were before the COVID crisis, sometime in the spring of 2022.
Great. Thanks for that. Our next speaker is it's Tsuneo Watanabe, who goes by Nabe Watanabe. Nabe is a senior fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. He is one of the most experienced and best known think tankers in Japan. He was a think tanker before think tanks were cool in Japan. He's been working at the Mitsui Global Strategies Studies Institute. He was at the Tokyo Foundation and even did a stint at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., one of America's top think tanks. And is an expert on international policy, is very experienced, has a very personal relationship to Japanese politics in terms of his family, and again, is a great commentator on what's happening in Japan, and in particular the U.S. Japan relationship. So without further ado, please, Nabe, take it away.
All right, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Larry, and also thank you very much for the invitation to the very interesting discussion early year of this year, 2021. Very interesting year. I think United States had a very interesting year last year, and maybe now presidential election. Election is always exciting. Japan election year is this year. So Prime Minister Suga really needed to the general election by October. And the Japan system, not presidential system, parliamentary cabinet system needed to election by the certain term expire. But only prime minister can choose when the person, prime minister, wants to have a snap election. And also, Prime Minister Suga need survive election, not only general election, but also LDP presidential election. That's very interesting here. And by the way, let me add a little bit my personal introduction. As Larry explained, I spent 10 years in Washington, D.C., CSIS, 1995 to 2005. So I have been on the Japanese politics watcher in Japan. And after I back in Japan, I spent many times in many years, Japanese think tank. I have been U.S. politics watcher. So I'm watching both. So today I'm happy to talk about Japanese politics. And, you know, the dynamics may change this year. I think U.S. changed the new leader. And last year, Abe resigned, and now Suga. But Suga is not fully approved by the party election. So Suga really needed to survive in the party. So new setting, US and Japan leadership. That's very interesting. And also both country, not only both country, but everybody in the world is facing a COVID-19. So how to survive? That's very important issue too. So first, let me look up at the current approval rate and the popularity of Suga administration. I think Suga's starting last year after surprising Abe's stepping down due to his own illness. I think Suga was elected as a LDP leader with full support of all of a faction except Kishida faction and Ishiba faction, because they have their own leader, Mr. Kishida, former foreign minister, and Mr. Ishiba, former defense minister, run against Suga. And major party faction pick up Suga. Suga, by the way, doesn't have his own faction. Suga doesn't belong to any faction. But a major faction pick up Suga. That's good things for Suga. Very, very lucky. But at the same time, Suga's power base on LDP is very weak and complicated. And the people are so frustrated with Suga's decision making is very slow. For example, state of emergency on COVID-19. Suga administration started emergency state last week, only in the Tokyo metropolitan area, Tokyo and Chiba, Kanagawa, and Saitama. And today, Suga expanded more other area like Osaka or actually I'm going to count Osaka, Kyoto, Hyogo, Aichi, Gifu, Tochigi, and Fukuoka. And people believe that too late, too slow. But considering a political structure of Suga, Suga cannot decide decisively, quickly, because Suga really need to consult with party leaders, especially faction leaders. Currently, major kingmaker of Suga is Mr. Nikai. Nikai is the leader of a faction, and of course, LDP is a secretary general. He's in charge for the election money and the election management. So that means Suga is based on the Nikai's faction. But at the same time, Suga really needed the former Prime Minister Abe's help, so Abe's faction, and also other faction. So, coordination is very important, and it takes a little bit more time. By the way, the Japanese Nikai. Nikai means two-story. So some people criticize Suga administration is a Nikai-date Naikaku, Nikai-date two-story building cabinet, because Suga is based on relied on the basis of a Nikai faction, Nikai-date. So that's one of the reasons. That strength over Suga somehow, because without faction, Suga become a prime minister. That's a great thing. But because of this, Suga really needed to on the party's intra-party balance. That's Suga's situation. So current approval rate of Suga is declining. For example, very recent NHK, that's Japan Public Broadcasting Corporation public poll conducted January 9th to 11th. Approval rate is 40%. This approval rate is 41%. That's margin of within the margin of error, almost similar. But the very first time since Suga's start, this approval rate is higher than approval rate. And the major reason for the approval is 39% answer that he's better than other cabinet. 23% answer that they can trust Prime Minister Suga character. And this approval reason is, I think, 40% answer that lack of management ability. That's one of the reasons people are so frustrated with slow decision making. And also 33% say that they cannot expect a good policy. And 11% answer they cannot trust Suga's character. And I'd like to point one thing. Suga is not a good communicator. Japanese prime minister usually is not so good communicator, except several cases like Prime Minister Koizumi or Prime Minister Abe is not so great communicator, except the security issue. He's good at the security issue, but he's not so good in economic and this kind of the public health issue. Suga is also very bad at the public health issue because he didn't experience such kind of a position. Suga is very strong in international communication. Not communication is not good, but I think infrastructure for communication or telecommunication, he's good. But he never experienced in the public health. So that gives him the very weakness. And some rumor says Suga is not seriously considering a COVID-19 issue. Some people say that Suga believes still the COVID-19 is a kind of a flu or a kind of a cold. That's I'm not sure. But many people started to doubt Suga is really serious about COVID-19 protection. So eventually now Suga is started to have a state of emergency and at least 1 month. So state of emergency expires February 7th. But according to the same poll by NHK, only 88% believe that expire date is not exactly the promised. I think that more people believe state of emergency continued after expiration date. That is the case. But by the way, the Japan's case for the COVID-19, the numbers of patients are surging, but numbers are very small. If you look at from the United States or Europe, probably why the Japanese people are so frustrated with the government policy. For example, Japanese COVID-19 patients, January 13th, yesterday, your time is today. That's 5,871. That's surge from the day before, 1,331. And the current patient number, 6,900. And how many total deaths since COVID-19 started? 4,275. Compared to US, compared to Europe, score is not so bad. But people are so frustrated because now the medical capacity in especially the major area, metropolitan area, is approaching to the limit of capacity. People are so worried about overcapacity. For example, COVID-19 beds in major metropolitan area is approaching to the over 80%. And people are, especially in the medical area, warning, if Japan doesn't restrain a surge of number, the function of a medical is facing a bankruptcy. So very weird, because Japan has a 1.6 million deaths for patients. That's 13.1 beds per 1,000 people. That's the largest number in the world. Why Japan is suffering from a shortage of beds? Because only 1.8% beds are available for COVID-19. That's clearly the failure of a coordination. So people are turning to the why Japanese government didn't do that, especially the after first surge in last year. And that is a very tough work, by the way. All hospitals are profit organization. They really wanted to survive in this COVID situation, but also financially. And also Japan Medical Association, that's Medical Doctors Group, the largest lobbyist to LDP. And the Ministry of Labor and Health, that's largest bureaucracy in Japan. The political leader really needed to coordinate this and try to find a very good preparation for the emergency beds for the COVID-19. And many experts say that, the last summer, Japan really needed to prepare for the third wave is coming. And many people, experts, say the government do that. But current result is the Japanese government didn't do that. Of course, that's the power transition from Abe to Suga, that unfortunate thing. And also, fortunate case is Japanese government got over first crisis. The second crisis is usually worse than the first crisis. So for Suga, how to survive current situation is a real key. If not, I think Suga may face a lot of criticism within the government. All right. And one interesting number I need to, Japanese economy is of course slowing down, but bankruptcy number over last year, 2020, was not so bad. you know, bankruptcy number of Japanese the corporation with the debt over 10,000 yen was a number is 7,800. That's the lowest in the past 10 years. Why? That's Japanese government allowed a lot of the loan with no high rate. So I have a very close Chinese economist working in a Japanese think tank. He said that he cannot find such a system in China. So he insisted Japan is a real socialist country. I know such kind of things is a good thing for the Suga. So if Suga really try to prevent a serious economic downturn and also prevent the serious surge for the trouble for the surge of death of COVID-19, he can survive. But if not, probably criticism is coming within LDP. And now opposition parties are doing good too. Once government ruling DPJ was split to the left wing and right wing, and but they merged very recently. So now they have almost all. They have a candidate almost all constituency. That's a little bit trouble. As long as economic performance is good, LDP easily can maintain the majority with a coalition partner Komeito. If not, a little bit trouble. And if Suga is losing seats, I think LDP faction leader demand, oh, maybe we need to change face. But such a situation is really up to how to survive COVID. And also Olympic. Olympic is also very symbolic and very good for the economy. That's up to the COVID too. For foreign policy, by the way, Suga continued free and open Indo-Pacific. That's Abe set up very good the strategy. What kind of strategy? That's first of all, the people in the world, the frustration against China is growing, especially in the United States. So the maintain the United States in the Pacific region. But at the same time, somehow liberalism in the world order in regional economy and world order, including Southeast Asia and the Asian neighbors. So I think the free and in the Pacific is not containment of China, but how to influence China with a peaceful way. At the same time, asking the U.S. to stay in presence in the Indo-Pacific area. So Suga, what Suga did as a foreign policy, first visited Vietnam and Indonesia, who has somehow a little bit anxiety with expansive China. That was good. And also Suga supported, hosted Quad foreign minister meeting in Japan, October. Quad is a U.S., Japan, India, Australia. And after that, Suga invited the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi. So Suga's the strategies just follow through from Abe. Why? Because Suga is a chief cabinet secretary of Abe. Abe's foreign policy was somehow prepared for the domestic coordination by Suga himself. He understands very well. So I have no trouble to see the Japan's foreign security policy. Very good follow through of Abe. But it's up to the how to survive COVID-19 in domestically. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Nabe. Just a real quick question, a follow up on one thing you said. You mentioned the Olympics. What are the chances that they would actually be canceled as opposed to going forward? What do you think is going to happen?
That's really up to the decision of IOC. So Japan's the government is very upbeat. Even for example, if COVID-19 continues, still the as long as the participants, athletes can come to the Japan, somehow Japan can conduct games without the audience. I think that's possible as long as U.S. NBC paying the money and NBC is happy to conduct without the audience. So I think the timing and of course the vaccination is also very important too. So still the Suga administration is very positive for the having Olympic. That's one of the reasons now Suga finally decided to the state of emergency and try to stop a surge of patients in the short term before Olympic decision was made.
Great, thanks. Well, we all hope it's going to happen, although I think most Americans know they're not, that even if they allow some audiences, they probably wouldn't allow Americans given our high infection rates. There's a lot of questions, Jesper, I wanted to come back to you on the M&A prediction that you've made, and that's, I think, a really interesting one. Could you talk a little bit more about where you think that's going to go? You mentioned, of course, U.S. financial institution, I think another country I've forgotten. What is also driving it in terms of, obviously different, M&A could come as a result of desire for larger scale. It could be that they want to bring in technologies from overseas to help them increase their productivity in Japan. It could be that they want to get into a whole nother business, like Toyota moving from looms to cars. What do you think is driving it? And just as a last part of this question, since we're here in Silicon Valley, do you see a lot of even more interest, because we've already seen a lot of interest from Japanese companies here, even more interest in coming and looking for acquisition targets in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's if I had the answer, you'd have to buy me a very expensive dinner, and all of that.
Anyway, Jesper.
but I think, look, if you're talking with CEOs here, it's very simple and very straightforward. And the number one reason is really just the market proximity, right? Because it's become very clear that we can talk about supply chains and the need to consolidate your supply chains while at the same time trying to diversify them. But at the end of the day, in the manufacturing business, what is first and foremost important is just proximity to your ultimate customer. And so from that perspective, when you look at the Japanese industrial sectors, you do see, whether it's in the machinery space, whether it is, even in the car space, whether it's in the chemical space, you do see the wish to expand into Indonesia. People, talk about Quad, which from a strategic perspective, obviously Australia, India, and the United States and Japan. I mean, just look at a map, that's what you need if you want to be credible vis-a-vis a rising People's Republic of China. But from a business perspective, if you have a strategic view, just look at Indonesia, as a country that has tremendously goodwill towards Japan. More than 90% of all the cars and motorcycles in Indonesia are Japanese, right? So, you've got a head start going there, and fine, there's some political risk, but the rise of the purchasing power there is absolutely enormous. You look at countries like Myanmar, like Cambodia, all those little Asian countries with 50, 60, 70 million people, that's a place where Japanese companies want to build a larger foothold. And what's very interesting, we all want to talk about Silicon Valley and all this sexy tech stuff, but it's the bread and butter business. I mean, look, for example, at what the Japanese retailers, are doing in Asia Pacific. If you look at the incredible power of the brand and the ability to expand the business of something like Lawson and something like Aeon, right? Around Asia Pacific. I mean, these are highly successful, globalized businesses. And it's very rare, as you know, for bricks and mortar, retailer to actually have a successful business outside of the home country, right? So Japanese companies are actually doing across a whole spectrum, of areas. They are doing the expansion. And the one thing that is very important is, domestically, right? The problem in the Japanese system, in the industrial structure, is something that Mr. Suga is actually very, very keen on rectifying, which is that Japan has excess competition. And if you look at the data, in the various industries, from steel pipes through to hairdressers, you name it, if you do the calculation, in Japan, in every industry, the top 4 companies control less than 11% of revenues. In the US, the top 4 companies on average now control 34% of all revenues. The US has a monopoly problem. Japan has an excessive, competition problem. And one of Prime Minister Suga's agenda items, which is why he's making a lot of enemies, is that he wants to get rid of all these, dare I say, zombie companies, right? And so it's quite interesting, that you've got, the domestic market plagued by excessive competition. Suga is looking at the regional banks and the consolidation there. That's obviously sort of the hub of the local economies, the hub of the small and medium-sized companies. And ironically, actually, the progress on consolidation of the regional banks over the last 6 months alone, has been very, very remarkable, right? It's obviously an ocean tanker that's going to move very slowly, but you talk about rectifying or trying to rectify, the fundamental structural problem of excess competition here in the domestic economy. Certainly the government, Prime Minister Suga, is focused on that, but as a result of that, you make a lot of enemies, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And actually, before turning to Tanabe, I just want to follow up on that point, and that is you obviously focused on outward M&A, but then you're also suggesting that, of course, there's a lot of consolidation going on within Japan, of course, even pre-COVID, but now it seems to be
Yeah,
Is that open possibilities for inward M&A?
No, but this is what is so exciting. This is one of my favorite statistics on Japan, right? Japan has 360,000 wholesalers, okay? 360,000 wholesalers. Of those 360,000 wholesalers, 2/3 do not have a customer who is a retailer or a producer. In other words, 2/3 of all of Japan's wholesalers are a middleman to another middleman. Now, that's, where consolidation, that's where efficiency gains, ought to be happening. And it's interesting, 10 years ago, the average age of the CEO of a wholesaler was 65. Now it's 75. And so actually, the irony is, why is there this domestic M&A boom? There are lots of reasons, but one of them is actually just simply the fact that, the founder CEOs are now old. The son and daughter has no business of wanting to take it over. And as a result of that, you've got some consolidation going on. But for American companies, it's all very nice and well. At the end of the day, the issue is, how do you get on the shelf? How do you get in front of the customer, right? And that's where this consolidation and the potential for restructuring at industry by industry level actually is opening up the import propensities, right, across a whole plethora of projects.
But do you think also that some of that M&A money will be coming from outside of Japan as well, or is it mainly going to be within Japan consolidated?
No, look, Japan is very good and has plenty of capital to slash around, right? But, there are areas, and this is obviously where Silicon Valley comes in very, very highly. Look, I'm as optimistic and as bullish on Japan as I want to be, but you also have to be a realist. Japan will never be a contender in software and cybersecurity. They simply don't have the number of engineers. Japan's, the total number of AI, artificial intelligence program capable engineers in Japan is less than the AI program capable engineers that Google employs. It's just not going to happen. right? So as a result of that, particularly for Silicon Valley, right, with your software-based solutions, right, in particular the security space, right? I mean, Japan should be a greenfield.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's going to be very interesting because one of the most in the world of finance, one of the most interesting developments, and to some people worrying development, is the fact that over the last 2 years, Japan has began to focus on national security as a tool, to potentially stop, global companies from inquiring and having greater voice, in Japanese corporate management, right? As you know, with the changes in the foreign exchange law that became effective last year, right? So we shall see how that's going to be coming out, but if there is one risk, in my opinion, right, is that Japan's closing inwards, right, under the mantle of national security, that Japan is actually losing out, on, potential step up, and technological breakthrough.
Yeah, of course, we share that problem here in the States with our new restrictive investment regime as well. Nabe, I don't know if you have any comments on that. I also wanted to ask you kind of a related question, which is that, as you mentioned, Suga's his destiny is very much based on his economic success between now and the fall. That's not very much time to do things from an economic policy point of view. What are for him the quick wins that he would like to see, that he thinks might make a difference, that would help him kind of shine his reputation so that he could go on and continue being the prime minister?
That's good question. Oh yeah, that's good question. What is the Suga's survival? Of course, economy is very important, but also even people's expectation of economy is not so high. So I think some people in the chat said the Japanese are not so free supporting having Olympic. But if Olympic is held, somehow good economic stimulus effect, one thing. And also somehow the Suga can show his own coordination ability. So again, it's a pretty much intra-party politics things. As long as Suga is showing full support of all faction, Suga can survive unless big landsliding defeat. I cannot think of it. But if Suga is frustrated with LDP leaders, faction leaders, probably more trouble is coming too. Already, for example, the one of our party leaders, Mr. Shimomura, chairman of Policy Research Council, expressed some frustration. If coming to by-election, if LDP's performance is not so good, we could think of Suga is a good face of LDP. And that comment was disputed by the Mr. Nikai, Secretary General of LDP. However, I think if people's frustration continues, I think such kind of a growing voice is growing. And also, Suga is not fully supported by the Mr. Abe or Mr. Aso. Mr. Aso has been Vice Deputy Prime Minister and supported Abe with Mr. Suga as the Chief Cabinet Secretary. However, they are not so good somehow, kind of a rival. And also, Mr. Abe even seeking an opportunity to come back to the prime ministership. I think that's very interesting coincidence. If Mr. Trump is coming back 2024, Abe can say, "Oh, it's only me to handle Trump." You know.
So you think it's possible that that Prime Minister Abe would actually come back again?
Abe really wanted to have such kind of idea, but now, unfortunately, it's like Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump is now being impeached. Mr.
Well, yeah.
Abe had a trouble for the illegal handling of election money, And Abe's staff was somehow the prosecuted, not so heavy punishment. So, but many people say that, oh, Abe is a bad food asking a staffer to be responsible. So maybe chances are very low. But what I'd like to say is intra-party conflict is still ongoing.
Yeah.
Suga is not fully supported by even Abe or Aso. So Suga really need to survive and maintain the full support of all factions.
Yeah, Jesper?
Yeah, Larry, if I may just chime in, I'm fascinated by Nabe's jumping on Mr. Suga here, and just for 30 seconds, let me just say that in my personal opinion, this man is a brilliant policymaker, because he is the only policymaker, the only leader of a free democracy that is not afraid to take on big corporations. And specifically, I'm talking about the fact that my telephone bill is going to be dropping by about 20% this year, because Prime Minister Suga had no problems calling in the CEOs of the 4 telecommunications companies into his office, showing them a chart that the average mobile phone contract in Tokyo is about 40% more expensive than it is anywhere else in the world. And he looked at them and says, this is a national embarrassment, fix it. This is phenomenally good policy because it raises the purchasing power of the people. Also, I think, when you look at, Prime Minister Suga's focus on raising the minimum wage, which, we can talk about in a separate session, but there's a lot of clear-cut evidence that actually raising the minimum wage, would do wonders to actually encourage greater productivity, here in the Japanese system. It creates a lot of enemies because it raises the labor cost profile, but in a corporate Japan where, the amount of cash sitting idly on balance sheet exceeds 1.6 times GDP, maybe a little bit more of pay to the people, is something that could actually be happening. So what I'm trying to say is that I fully agree with with Watanabe, with Nabe, that, we can talk about the mishandling or the lack of handling of the COVID situation, which, quite frankly, there is no magic answer. What is the right policy? Nobody knows, right? And he has been a terrible communicator. There's absolutely no question about that. But, stepping back from this man rules by power, and he does want to hold people accountable. And for example, the reason for why the LDP is now annoyed with him, because he has put down his foot in the upcoming lower house election. They will actually apply a rule that has never been applied, which is that, as you know, in Japan, you can get elected in either a first around the post district or on the proportional list vote. But there is a rule in the LDP bylaws that says if twice you have not won in the single district, but only became a member of parliament because of the proportional list vote, if you've done that twice, not capable of winning in the district, the third time around, you won't be allowed to be on the list, which is, from my perspective, a pretty good rule to actually have. He wants to enforce it in the next upcoming election. And of course, as a result of that, there's about 40 LDP politicians, who have never won in a single district, only slipped in on the proportional rule. So what I'm trying to say is, he's actually a man, who makes decisions and wants to hold people accountable, which in my book, certainly as a non-Japanese, is not a bad way to lead a country.
Nabe, any reaction to that?
I think the Suga is. I think I'm trying to answer the chat too. I think what is a major policy of Suga different from Abe? That's related to the Jesper's talk. I think Suga's expertise is communication area industry. So Japanese paying a huge money to the cell phone compared to the other country. So try to lower the cell phone fee. I think it's relatively easier for Suga to do that with the help of bureaucrats. So this kind of things are one thing. And the other one is the carbon zero, carbon emission zero by 2050. That's corresponding to the Biden administration's policy. And that's what is the case. It's not so easy for Japan to the carbon zero, but the Suga administration is expecting more investment to the renewable energy, and setting money in Japan could be used for the investment for the new area. What is a new area? Probably that renewable energy area too. That's some kind of expectation. But at least Suga is a more economic related policy rather than foreign security policy. That's Suga's expertise and a strong area.
Great, thanks. Well, we'll move to, we are already moving to audience Q&A, so please keep your questions coming. And if you would like to ask a question in person, please use the raise hand function under participants, and we'll call on you and take some time. So I'm not seeing any now. Actually, let me pull, Mike Fletcher had a question, and let me see if Mike, would you like to ask that question orally as opposed to me just reading it off here? Miho, can you get Mike unmuted?
Yeah, I'm here, Larry.
Yeah, I think he can do it, yes.
You don't want me to turn
Go
on
ahead,
video?
Mike.
Okay. Well, I was really curious about the startup situation in Japan. The government has been, the government has been, apologize, that might be a little better. The government's been fostering the startup environment in Japan, certainly over the last few years, and the private sector has been coming along as well. And I'm wondering, just with respect to the financial pressures that we face from the COVID recoveries and some of the things that both of the speakers were talking about, how that might impact the investment, both in the public as well as the private sector, with respect to investing in startups.
If I may, I think it's a phenomenal question, and I think that the short answer is you will see an acceleration of it, and you actually find what's very exciting is that now the large industrial companies are actually beginning to encourage intrapreneurship. So you find that even I guess it was pioneered by Google and others in the Silicon Valley, that if you're an engineer and you want to use 15 or 20% of your time to futz around and come up with something, once a quarter, once every half year, we have an internal competition. And if your project gets approval, gets selected, then you can take 50% of your time while on the Toshiba payroll. And that's actually, when you look at Omron, when you look at Toshiba, when you look at Fujitsu, that didn't happen 2 or 3 years ago. That's now starting to happen, and it's being embraced. And you find that also the corporate venture capital, right, is actually being beefed up. And in addition to that, you're actually seeing, very interesting, venture capital firms, right, now coming here to the market. There's, we can talk about it offline afterwards, but there's actually, even in the deep tech university collaboration research space, right, there's a couple of funds that raised, almost $500 million just over the last 12 months, stepping up their cooperation with the various research universities here in Japan, which is very, very exciting, right? That's, again, something that, 3 or 4 years ago just wouldn't exist, right? Now it's actually starting to be happening. And I think that, famous last words, but as Americans know better than anything else, right? I mean, nothing succeeds like success. And I've got success stories now. I've got real success stories. I may not have a large number of unicorns, right, in terms of the IPOs, but I do have, if you look at the Japanese IPO space, right, you find that of the companies that went to the market last year, right, and by the end of the year, you find all of them trading above their IPO price, right, and most of them actually trading more than 70% above their IPO price. So that's good news. And if you're the guy who manages money or who's the CIO at Nippon Life, you're looking at this very carefully and say, here is an uncorrelated asset that actually in the domestic non-currency risk market actually makes me money. So it's a long-winded answer, I think, and we're quite involved in this. It's a very exciting landscape. And the good news is, you now have talent. You now actually have talent. I mean, it's no longer a stigma. If you're the 32-year-old engineer at Toshiba, it's no longer a stigma to break away. And angel investment taxation laws, as you're probably aware, did change 2 years ago, right? So as a result of that, I think the ecosystem for startups, right, is actually developing very nice and very healthily. By the way, I don't know whether you're an investor or what your business is, but if you look like for like, as much as you can do it, if you have to pay $4 for a startup, in the United States, you have to pay $1 in Japan. So come here, we got the value.
So Mike, you have a new career in investment coming up here. Mike is just recently retired NASA official. He's a spaceman.
Oh, you're a spaceman. Oh, even better. There you go.
So
there you go.
And very, very into space tech and the tech community here. So I don't know, Nabe, if you had any comments on that. I did have some questions on China that I just wanted to throw your way, and we haven't talked much about it. The recent, basically the more muscular Chinese policy in the region, what they're doing with Australia, kind of punishing them for their position on COVID. Of course, we have the U.S. very much in a confrontation with China. Where do you see that going this year, and particularly in terms of how the U.S. and Japan relate to each other?
China has been always a headache for the Japan and the U.S. And also, that's one of the reasons actually I pointed out Quad foreign minister meeting was very important before the inviting Wang Yi, foreign minister of China. I think the big trouble is, of course, that's the nature of Japan, is the heavily rely on the Chinese market. At the same time, heavily rely on the U.S. Military presence. So, but that's nature of not only Japan, South Korea too, or somehow the Australia too. So the Japan's strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific, is first of all, Japan secure the U.S. presence in the region and making a counterbalance against the assertive Chinese military action. And also, also have a lot of friends who share this kind of common goal in free and open Indo-Pacific. That's the existing world order and the prosperity in the region. And like-minded partner is India, Australia is very important for Japan, but eventually ASEAN country or South Korea, even Canada or EU. These are middle power, the players join this kind of securing the regional order. I think that's safe way for Japan. Japan always wondering how much seriously US is try to constrain Chinese economic activity. I think so far decoupling of a US policy, it seems to me complete decoupling is impossible, but partial decoupling or US policymaker says partial disengagement to China. That is really critical. Of course, Japan do not oppose it. Japan is also shares the idea that China may acquire the very critical military technology who can change the military balance. That's going to be big trouble for Japan. But at the same time, for Japanese business, what kind of technology Japan cannot transfer? What kind of products? That's a kind of a nightmare over the old days. I remember the Toshiba Kokomu incidents. So Japanese government and the companies are now anxiously to know what is the US position. And also Japanese government is started already the close communication with the US government for the how to address China in so-called economic statecraft area. It's combined with not just economic trade, but also security result. that is the case. That is the situation now.
Yeah, export controls will be definitely one of the big issues that the new administration is going to have to look at, given the major changes that we saw in the Trump administration. Back actually to a COVID-related question, let me turn to Anna Nielsen, who has a question on kind of the differences of working from home and the impact on women. So Anna, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your very interesting comments, both to Mr. Cole and Mr. Watanabe. I have a question for either of you, but perhaps more specifically for Mr. Cole, as he was discussing the rise in telecommunication. And I've noticed some trends as well in this last year that it seems more acceptable to be able to work from home. And something that I study is the impact of rural depopulation of various areas, people, wow, especially young people wanting to move into Tokyo, and the belief that you can't really get a decent job, a high-paying job, unless you happen to be in a major city and have access to be able to commute to the office of a major company or whoever has hired you. And so I wanted to ask, with regards to this new acceptability of telecommuting and working from home, do you think this is signaling a more permanent change, or that things will go back to normal after COVID-19 is no longer a threat? Do you think more people are likely to move to rural areas and be able to stay there and kind of mitigate the issues of that falling population? Or do you think that overall there won't be a change in this trend?
No, it's very, very exciting. And I'm so glad that you brought this up, because, you know, in terms of the social dynamics and the work-life balance, you know, this is actually the most exciting thing that is going on here. And you may have seen that for the first time in, you know, 2 or 3 generations, you know, the population of metropolitan Tokyo actually had a net decline, with actually people in their 40s and 50s, you know, leaving. It's also interesting, you may have seen that the Japanese rural real estate market, right, has actually been recovering over the last 12 months, you know, precisely because, you know, you've got people in their 30s and 40s now realizing it's like, look, if I don't have to schlep to the office, I can actually be out in the countryside, I can be with my kids, I can, you know, do all sorts of things. So with a little luck, you know, the fact that some of the leading companies like Hitachi, like Fujitsu, like Toyota are openly embracing and encouraging, you know, the telecommuting. You know, and whatever the rules are going to be, as you know, this is Japan, so you need to have a set of rules, right? That's going to be defined by each and every company. I don't think that you're going to see government decrees, I mean, nor should you, but the corporate culture, you know, is actually changing. And I think that this is, in my personal opinion, I would make a bet, you know, that this is actually a structural change that is here to stay. And that, you know, for the younger generation in particular, you know, a better work-life balance, right? Which includes, you know, sort of being not in some danchi somewhere stuck in the middle of Saitama, not Saitama, Kawasaki, and you know, being somewhere out, you know, where there is actually green and countryside stuff. I think that you're right. I think that that's, you know, in my personal opinion, I think that that's a big trend. Let me give you a couple of examples that are actually very interesting, because you also have some of the technology company leaders here in Japan are actually very, very focused on promoting regional development. So for example, the guy who runs, you know, Yahoo Japan, he's from Kanazawa, and he leaves Tokyo every Thursday morning. And if you want to have a meeting with him, it's very welcome, but you're going to have to do it in Kanazawa. And they're having wild parties now in Kanazawa on the weekends, which was never before seen in Kanazawa. I'm just trying to tell you that, you know, there's also, never mind Hitachi, never mind Fujitsu, the Keidan-Ren establishment, but of the younger companies who now have money and real power and real influence, right? They are leading the change in corporate culture. And for example, if you're an engineer and you're offered a much better work-life balance contract at, say, Yahoo Japan versus a 9-to-5, you got to be at your desk contract at, you know, Toshiba, there's no question where you're going to go, right? So it's very interesting that COVID as a catalyst for this, you know, I mean, I sometimes, I used to joke with Prime Minister Abe, or former Prime Minister Abe, because, he was doing hataraki kata kaikaku, right? Which was like enforced, changes in the life-work balance, which we all hated because it just meant that we needed to trace people. Oh my God, you're still in the office after 5 o'clock. That's terrible, et cetera, et cetera. But where Abenomics failed in changing work-life balance, Coronanomics is actually succeeding. And I think you're onto something very, very important here.
Great. Well, Nabe, did you have any views on that? And in particular, this rule issue, of course, is really important for the LDP, since that's where most of their support comes from. Does this play into the politics?
Yeah, I think I'm not kind of a half mixed, optimistic and pessimistic for the Japanese culture, Japanese working culture. And the good side is, of course, COVID change. That Jesper explained very well. I don't think Japanese corporate culture can go back to the before COVID-19. And for example, I never worked in my office. I keep working in my home, and no problem, no trouble, for example. I think once people are getting used to such kind of things, I think not so easy for going back to the difficult one. And also very interesting, the current trend is many companies accepted the side job for their workers. In the before, somehow, especially largest companies asking their company worker fully concentrate on their work. But instead, they are somehow guaranteed their job, the lifetime. But probably such kind of corporate culture cannot work. And many people don't believe they are permanently employed in one company. So people, the idea, behavior is changing, especially in the young generation. Very interesting recent one. I don't know you are familiar with the Japanese the juken system, that's the entrance examination. The best and brightest, most difficult school was University of Tokyo Bunichi. That's the mostly law faculty and the political science faculty. And second difficult was economics department of Tokyo University. But last examination test changed, trading place. Most difficult one is economic area rather than law faculty. That means that people do not prefer the bureaucratic work in a big company, but a more real economic area. And actually, such a people prefer not to work in the largest company. Even if they started in the largest company, eventually they wanted to have their own company, their own starting up. That's clearly younger generation's mindset is changing.
Thanks very much. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I think we've covered most of the questions that were in the chat. I just want to say that I clearly have been proven wrong. I started out by saying that I thought 2021 was going to be a boring year, but Nabe and Jesper have convinced me that I was wrong, that in fact it's going to be a really exciting year, and now I'm really pumped up. So I hope that enthusiasm continues in the weeks to come. Again, thank you very much, Jesper and Nabe, for a great discussion. Thank you all for participating and coming. Before we close it, let me ask our president.